Welcome to Restoring Black History, one gravestone at a time, and my journey to be enlightened by the truth. This is The Grave Truth. Manuel Williams was born December 7, 1902 in Georgia and died November 5, 1974 in Pasco County, Florida. Manuel joined the Army young and was part of the biggest group of 100 Negro men to be deployed from Tampa to Camp Devens in Massachusetts and were given a royal send-off. In 1935, Manuel is 30 years old, married to Sarah, 28, and has 3 children, Lonnie, Charles, and Julia May. Manuel's profession is a mill worker, and they're living in a small town called Lacoochee, Florida, where they remain to raise a total of 8 children and are devoted to their local church, Mount Moriah Baptist Church. What's interesting here is that the family listed just below the Williamses on the census are Jerome Owens and his family, who I featured in another video. They are all living in what was called the, quote, big quarters, which was a big house owned by their employer, Cummer Sons Cypress Company. In 1940, Manuel and Sarah are 37. He's working at the sawmill, and they now have 6 children. Manuel Jr., Charles, Julia May, twin sons Alvin and Albert, and James. Amazing again that another video I just did on a Mr. Gurley Thompson is also listed on this census with the Williams family. All 3 of these families lived together in the big quarters and worked together at the sawmill and raised their families in this small country town in Pasco County. 5 years later, in 1945, Manuel and Sarah are 40. Their oldest son, Manny Jr., left school in middle school and was working at the same sawmill as his father. Also, by this time, all 8 kids are living at home. They are Manny Jr., Charles, Julia May, Alvin, Albert, James, Shirley Ann, and Joanne. In 1950, Manuel and Sarah are 46. They're still living in the same house in Lacoochee, and he's still working at the sawmill. And by this time, the first 2 oldest sons, who are now 20 and 21, are also working there. Let's talk about the town of Lacoochee and what Manuel's life was like working at this sawmill. Lacoochee was a logging town that was rich in cypress trees. In the early 1900s, a logging company called Cummer Sons Cypress Company moved there and became one of the main employers of the town. On its property was Cummer Quarters, an entire neighborhood of small to medium-sized homes for its employees, as well as one very large building called the Big House, or Big Quarters, which housed the colored workers and was located 1 block away from the sawmill. None of these buildings exist today. In fact, the First Baptist Church of Lacoochee and its cemetery are located on the former Cummer Quarters grounds. The work of extracting the cypress from swampy terrain was backbreaking work, and these folks did it day in and day out, many of them for their whole life. This video shows what it was like and what people like Manuel endured every day.
Cummer Sons Cypress Company is no longer in existence, and the big cypress mills of the past have all gone. The only thing that remains are the small band mills that cut small cypress. The huge monarchs of the cypress are a thing of the past. Just for your information, cypress trees were full grown the day that the giant sequoias of California first sprung from the ground. It was not unusual to cut a tree that had been in existence for more than 3,000 years. Relating back to the one that the man just crawled over, it was probably a full-grown tree the day that Christ was born, and it took just a few minutes to cut it down, and it has been changed into a way of lumber and a kind of lumber that is almost impossible to find. Of course, there's a few trees left in scattered remote areas that makes it almost impossible to harvest. The crews that you see going into the woods, this is a daily occurrence. Happened summer and winter. Had no regard to time or to rain or to cold weather. And these people that you see working here, everybody at that time worked for roughly 10 cents an hour. And they did not work from 8 o'clock in the morning until 5 in the afternoon. They would probably get up at some very, very early hour and then take off to the woods. And there they would stay until 4:30, 5 o'clock in the afternoon until they finished their cutting, and they'd be picked up and coming home. This part was filmed in 1946, and the last part was filmed in 1958, where you will see the last day that the mill was in operation. All in. They'll notch the tree on one side, then they'll do their cutting with their hand-driven cross-cut saws on the back side of that notch, and they can just about drive a peg in the ground with where that tree will fall. They were that good. This is kind of a little bit of a rough way to make a living, but I think maybe you'll appreciate the fact that you have a position that was quite better than, the working conditions were quite better than what you're going to see. This is rather a large tree they're going to work on this time, and you'll see how they'll do it the same way they've done it in the past, and has probably been done since cypress was first harvested. The man down there is having a little bit of tough footing, and he's also carrying the crosscut, as you can well see. They're doing their notching the same way as you saw it in the past there. They're notching it, and this will be falling into the river, and then they'll float it from there down to their nearest pickup point. And you can see the ring on the trees where the high water marks are too. The high water mark is just below the axe handle there. They'll walk out now and cut the topping out of the tree, which they would leave in the woods, or leave in the river, or leave wherever they cut it. And then, of course, the main log itself is what they would float down to the nearest bridge or to the nearest area that they would put it out with some sort of mechanical equipment to be loaded onto the flat cars to be hauled back to the mill. First thing you're going to ask is, how about the moccasins? Well, when these men started working, the moccasins made a hasty retreat and got out of their way. These people worked, as I said, in winter and in summer, and they did not ever slack down or slow up. It was a hard way to make a living, but at that time, 10 cents an hour and regular work was pretty well thought of. And this, good or bad, was regular work. Cutting this one underwater, you can well see, and that didn't slow them down. They're holding on to their axe handles. If you notice, they're holding on their axe handles to give them balance both in the water and to keep them from pushing themselves away from their cutting area.
At its peak, workers lived in about 100 homes along the streets with wood sidewalks in Lakuchi. Cummer Sons employed 1,200 workers, and it was one of the few who were able to provide jobs during the Great Depression. The company finally closed in the 1950s when the cypress was all depleted, and they relocated to the Everglades to continue their efforts. Now, I don't have any information on Manuel's parents, but since he and his wife had a large family, I wanted to introduce you to some of them. So we're going to start with his wife, Sarah. She was born in 1902 in Florida, and in 1984, she was in the newspaper for a story about 2 escaped convicts who were found hiding in her yard in Lakuchi. After a 12-hour manhunt, they finally found one of them hiding in a hog pen in Sarah's backyard while she was inside the house. Sarah died in 1994 at the age of 91, and at that time she had 31 grandchildren, 65 great-grandchildren, 19 great-great-grandchildren, and 25 great-great-great-grandchildren. What a big family. Now, we begin with the oldest son, Manuel Williams, Jr. He was born in 1928 and married twice. His first wife, Cordell, died in 1983. They had 7 children. Christopher, who married Juanita, a daughter, Launita, who married Frederick Gray, a daughter, Helen, who married Harrison Wilson, a daughter, Antoinette, a daughter, Joyce, who married Fred Harold, a daughter, Mary, and a daughter, Ollie Mae, who was married twice. Manuel Jr.'s second wife was Barbara, who was with him until he passed. Manuel was an ordained deacon of the First Mount Baptist Church of Trilby, Florida. Like his father, Manuel was a U.S. Army veteran, enlisted in November of 1950, and discharged a year later in 1951. The draft card states he too worked with his father at Cummer Sons Cypress Company. In 2006, he's mentioned and pictured in a Veterans Day article called Remembering Blacks' Contributions. It says, and I quote, "Lakuchi native Manuel Williams Jr. landed in a segregated unit after being drafted in 1950, 2 years after the military had officially desegregated. Medical reasons kept him from going to Korea with the 293rd Engineering Battalion, which built roads and repaired bridges. He was honorably discharged after serving less than a year." Manuel was also involved in local town politics and worked tirelessly to improve the place he called home, as well as being a member of the PTA and actively involved in his church. He's mentioned in every article here, and there are more where that came from. A pretty impressive guy with a big heart and passionate about his family and the community. The next of Manuel and Sarah's children to highlight is Albert Williams and Alvin Williams, twin brothers born in 1937. Albert married Joan and had 3 children, Deborah Ann, Barbara Ann, and Albert Tony. Shockingly, Albert was shot to death at the age of 36 by a young man of 21 years old named James Charles McCrae. It was reported that they quarreled on a railroad track near Lakuchi, and McCrae was arrested shortly thereafter for murder. He was ultimately sentenced to 20 years in prison. Albert is buried at Trilby Cemetery with his father. Now, his twin brother Alvin, whose nickname was Shoestring, was married to Lily Pearl for 35 years, and they had 3 children. Harold Cummings, which was Lily's son prior to Alvin, Kathy, and Holly. In 1980, Alvin was stabbed after an altercation at a bar and was later determined to be justified self-defense. After being in critical condition at the hospital, Alvin recovered from his injuries. In 2014, at the age of 77, Alvin died in his sleep at home. Going back to Manuel Williams Sr., he died on November 5, 1974, and is buried at the unkept and deteriorating Trilby African American Cemetery, also known as Old Trilby Colored Cemetery. There's a video about that cemetery, if you'd like to watch, in more detail about the terrible condition that the cemetery's in and the terrible condition of the gravestones and how more than 100 people are buried there with no gravestones or markers at all anymore. Rest in peace, Manuel Williams, Sarah, all of your children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and so on.